It's not, but we have a sword or a dragon. Okay, you're gonna call the queen? Sure. And she got the.
Yes.
It's well worn.
Okay, I'll choose the second resolution about the
All things do this. First off, I'd like to congratulate our competitors, Peyton Maxwell, for his representation. Oh, we're not. It's okay. Your mom said to wait. Okay, yes, I know. All right, does anybody tap dance? Do you want to? Guys, get some good. So in New Braunfels, we have clogging. If you've ever heard of clogging, it's a horn tap dancing. I don't do that either. There's Mrs. Klein. Yes, you were good. Yes. Okay. All right, so I'm going to start that over again. Ladies, representing the negative side is Maxwell. And representing the affirmative side is Brendan McKinley. Introduce our esteemed panel of judges. We have 9 judges here today. I can't see anymore. But our first judge is Trenton Walter. Trenton is a graduate of the College of the Ozarks School of Business. He's currently a field project supervisor for Walmart in Bentonville, Arkansas. He's also a former STOA competitor. Georgine Tilton is on this side. Georgine is a graduate from USC and a former corporate manager. She homeschooled her 2 daughters through high school, who now have both graduated college, and she co-founded the Lighthouse, Missouri Speech and Debate Squad. Currently, Mrs. Tilton spends her time as an industrial real estate investor, the vice president of the Greene County Republican Women's Club, a Greene County Republican Central Committee member, and a leader in Bible Study Fellowship International. And next on our panel is Suzanne Myrie. She's from Tennessee. She has a master's degree in communication, and she is the leader of Momentum Debate and Speech in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. All right. She also has children competing in this tournament, and she's been judging for 12 years. Okay, next on our panel is Robert Wilson. It's on this side. He's from California. His background is 27 years as a lawyer, 17 with the California Attorney General. He's in the government and law section, and he's presently the general counsel to the California Bureau of Firearms. He has, Mr. Wilson is a parent. He's here for the kids. From judging and serving for 3 years. Right. We also have Alexandria Dinsmore on this side. She is originally from California, but currently she's in New York City. And Alexandria competed in homeschool speech and debate for 6 years and was nationally ranked in both STOA and NCFCA speech and debate. For the past 6 years, Alexandria has enjoyed returning to NITOC as an alumni judge and a representative of the King's College, where she currently works full-time on staff. Thank you. And we have Dr. Eric Morris right here in the center. He is the Director of Forensics and an Assistant Professor at Communication at Missouri State University in Springfield. His teaching and research interests include classical rhetoric, rhetorical theory, presidential debates, and political communication. Dr. Morris has been coaching college debate for over 25 years and has coached national championship teams, national top speakers, and was the National Debate Tournament's Coach of the Year in 2008. Dr. Morris will also be around for a while after the final round of independence to learn more about MSU debate. And Shane Scholler is right here on the end. Thank you so much. He's the former Speaker Pro Tem of the Missouri House of Representatives. He has represented parts of Greene County, including the city of Springfield, during his 3 terms in the Missouri House. In the House, he has served on committees that reviewed budget appropriations, utilities, taxation, and revenue, and chaired the Disaster Recovery Committee under the Joplin tornado of 2011. He was unanimously chosen by his peers as the House's second-ranking official in 2011, and eventually served as Speaker upon the resignation of then-Speaker Stephen Tilley. He was also the Republican nominee for the Missouri Secretary of State in 2012. And he recently elected in 2014 by the Greene County voters to serve as their county clerk. He has attended the Southwestern Baptist University in Bolivar, Missouri, where he earned his Bachelor of Science degree in Political Science and Psychology. And he and his wife are the parents of Timothy, Dorothy, and John. They live here in Missouri, and he is an attorney for the Preferred Family Health. Okay, and our final esteemed judge for today is Ms. Jay Ashcraft. And right here, I should have deduced this, right? As a lifelong Missourian, Jay Ashcraft is committed to ensuring our state remains a great place to live, do business, and raise their family. He was born in Jefferson City, Missouri, spent his youth, graduated from Jefferson City High School, then earned his bachelor's degree in engineering management from the Science and Technology. Then he moved to West Plains, and he worked for a defense-based engineering company. Master's degree in engineering. He's worked several years in the defense industry and is now an assistant professor at the St. Louis Community College, where he has taught engineering and technology courses. And many of his former students have carried their capabilities into jobs into the auto manufacturing industry nearby. He's also volunteered with local public school students to just encourage an interest in math and science. And he just maintains a key interest in local schools and their vital necessary role in building a best in the nation workforce. So he's now into a practice of law. He has graduated from the St. Louis University School of Law. He's a member of the Missouri Bar, earned multiple certifications in the area of privacy and data protection. He has practiced law for 6 years, counseling clients on legal issues ranging from regulatory compliance to patent prosecution. Jay, along with his wife, Katie, and their 4 children, live in unincorporated St. Louis County. He's active in his church and a certified youth coach with the Catholic Youth Council Sports. He's also the son of former United States Attorney General John Ashcroft and Janet
First step's a doozy.
Hi, I'm Tina, community speaker. Thank you so much for judging today.
Brendan McKinley, your affirmative speaker. Judging. Brendan McKinley, affirmative. Judging. Brendan McKinley, your affirmative. Judging. And Brendan, your affirmative speaker. Thanks for your time. Brendan McKinley, affirmative. Thanks for judging. And thanks for timing. Alright. Is it okay with the judges if I use my phone to time in addition to timer over there? Okay. So that's 6 minutes. Okay. All my judges are ready. My timer. Great. Danny Roderick of Harvard University stated that, quote, historically nothing has worked better than economic growth in enabling societies to improve the life chances of their members, including those at the very bottom, unquote. Of growth is the only way for developing countries to fulfill the basic needs of their citizens and ultimately to progress to prosperity. Therefore, I stand resolved that developing countries ought to prioritize economic growth over environmental protection. And to begin today's debate round, we'll go ahead and provide a few key definitions, starting out with the definition of a developing country. It's defined as a country with little industrial and economic activity and where people generally have low incomes. Economic growth is defined as an increase in the capacity of an economy to produce goods and services, compared from one period of time to another. And prioritize is defined as to organize things so that the most important thing is done or dealt with first. The value I will be upholding in today's debate round is basic needs. I, as the affirmative, will be upholding the value of basic needs, defined as access to and shelter. This value is paramount because it's absolutely foundational to all other values that a developing country can hold. The basic goal of all society should be to meet the basic needs of their citizens. Contention 1. Affirming the resolution ensures basic needs. Affirming the resolution ensures basic needs. Application, poverty reduction. Poverty reduction. By definition, poverty is the state of lacking the materials necessary to meet your basic needs. Reducing poverty, therefore, is the most effective method of guaranteeing basic needs to the individuals of a developing country. Countless studies have documented the relationship between economic growth and poverty reduction. A study published by the National Bureau of Economic Research concluded that the world's economic growth over the final years of the 20th century was crucial in reducing poverty. Africa concluded that, quote, poverty seems to co-move with GDP almost perfectly, unquote. In other words, economic growth and poverty reduction improved at virtually the exact same rates. Simply put, when a nation prioritizes economic growth, it's better equipped to meet the basic needs of its citizens. Contention 2. Negating the resolution cannot provide basic needs. Negating the resolution cannot provide basic needs. Application 1, energy poverty. Energy poverty. Even in the developed world, when priority is given to environmental protection, the effects on the poor are catastrophic. In Germany, green energy policies have resulted in an 80% rise in electricity prices, contributing to something called energy poverty, a situation in which individuals have to spend more than 10% of their income on energy alone. electricity prices have risen by 50% due to the large investment in renewables by the British government. As a result, the number of people living in energy poverty has increased to 17% of the population, and the amount of excess winter deaths has increased because citizens simply cannot afford to heat their homes. If we see this effect in the developed world, then how much more will we see it in developing nations? We can see the answer to this question in application 2, which is electricity access. Electricity access. In developing countries, many people are in desperate need of shelter and heat. Without access to cheap electricity, the poor are forced to resort to burning twigs and animal dung to heat their homes. This can cause cancer, strokes, and heart disease. According to the World Health Organization, 3.8 million people die annually from diseases connected to this method of gaining heat, and most of those who have to resort to it live in developing countries. Unfortunately, environmental protection policies cannot fix this problem. Only rapid economic growth can do that. According to research published by the National Center for Policy Analysis, quote, in the developing world, millions are dying because they must burn twigs and dung to heat their homes. These poverty-stricken nations need access to cheap electricity, yet the developed world wants these nations to use solar panels. A $10 billion renewable energy investment would lift 20 million Africans out of poverty. But a $10 billion investment in gas electrification, that would lift 90 million out of poverty, unquote. Renewables simply cannot provide for poverty reduction and access to cheap electricity, as well as affirming the resolution can. Contention 3, priority must be given to economic growth. Priority must be given to economic growth. The question posed by the resolution is which ought to come first, economic growth or environmental protection? Obviously, the environment is important, but developing countries must initially focus on their economy to meet their needs both in the short and the long term. Once a country has a strong economy, it's better equipped to protect its environment. And the application under this point is the EKC, or the environmental Kuznets curve. The environmental Kuznets curve, or the EKC, is an empirically observed relationship between the economic growth of developing countries and their respective environments. Usually, developing countries bring some harm to their environment at first by prioritizing economic growth and reducing poverty. But eventually, with the improved access to technology that economic growth brings, countries are able to reverse this trend and benefit their environments in the long run. According to research published by Oxford's Quarterly Journal of Economics, quote, we find no evidence that environmental quality deteriorates steadily with economic growth. Rather, for most indicators, economic growth brings an initial phase of deterioration followed by a subsequent phase of improvement. The turning points for the different pollutants vary, but in most cases they occur before a country reaches a per capita income of $8,000. One example of the EKC in action is the United States of America. When America was making the jump from a mainly agricultural nation to a more industrialized nation, we obviously polluted our environment to some degree. Realized and grown our economy, we were able to decrease the pollution and clean up our environment. This is the reason why most developed countries have far cleaner environments than many developing countries. Initially, growth must have priority over the environment so that basic needs may be met. And for that reason, more than anything else, please vote aye. Thank you.
So are all the judges ready? Okay, are you ready?
Yep.
Okay. So great speech. I obviously have a few questions. First, starting off with your value. Now,
Okay.
could you please reread your definition of basic needs?
It's defined as access to food, water, and shelter.
Okay, now do you think an important contributor to basic needs is also the health of its citizens, the health of developing countries' individuals?
Sure, yeah, and I think economic growth is the best way to improve that.
Okay, now did you, in your definition of basic needs, is health included, or basically is it the overall quality of life, or is it simply basically shelter, food?
It's the initial step to protecting quality of life in the long run. If you don't have access to food and water and shelter, you're going to die before your basic needs or before your quality of life can be protected.
Okay, so it doesn't specifically talk about the health of the people, which could be the most significant.
The question of the resolution is what's the initial step? And the initial thing to focus on is basic needs.
Okay, so moving on to your contention one, of basically affirming the resolution meets the basic needs. Now, you said that you brought up countless studies of basically how economic growth reduces poverty, correct?
Right, that's the consensus.
Okay, now could you just, what was the source for that study?
The specific one that I looked at was the National Bureau of Economic Research, and I also had a case study of Africa. If you want to contest those, we can bring them up.
Okay, now, do you know any specifics on if the overall GDP increase actually trickled down to the people at the basic poverty level, or did it kind of just
Yes.
add to the people at the top? who are
That's
already
the
rich?
point, is that
Okay.
without economic growth, there's no way to reduce poverty. With economic growth, poverty is reduced.
Okay, now is prioritizing economic growth the only way to reduce poverty?
I think it's the best way to reduce poverty.
The best way, okay. So moving on to contention 2, now you're basically here saying that negating the resolution doesn't equal the basic needs, correct?
Right.
Okay, now, so I got application 2, the electricity access. Did you have an application 1, or what was the timeline for that?
Yeah, the application one was energy poverty.
Could you please clarify the argument briefly so I can make sure I
Totally,
understand?
yeah. Renewables are expensive, and when you invest in them, electricity prices necessarily go up, making it more expensive for people to heat their homes. So even in developed nations, we see people dying because they literally can't heat their homes. If we try to impose a standard on
Okay.
developed nations, sorry, yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
so it's kind of the same argument that basically economic growth allows them to afford cleaner access to energy or.
Better access to
Better
energy, better
access.
access to shelter.
Okay, now, so last few questions about contention 3. Now, basically, you said that priority must be economic growth, and you
Right.
brought up the example of the Kuznets curve.
Right.
Now, are you aware that the Kuznets curve is actually a hypothesis or a theory?
It's an empirically demonstrated hypothesis,
Okay,
and
how
it
does that-
totally makes sense.
Okay, that
Like,
makes sense.
when you see countries that have developed their economies to the point where they're a developed nation, you see cleaner environment.
Okay, now, do you have any evidence saying that it was empirically proven, or is that simply a quote?
We can
saying that
bring up
it was an
empirics,
idea?
but also, like, just empirically, every developed nation is going to have a cleaner economy than developing nations because they have more money to protect their environment with.
Okay, now would you agree that prioritizing even as stated in your own evidence, that prioritizing economic growth does lead to an initial phase of degradation to the environment?
Right, that's the
Okay.
necessity of the resolution, but
Okay.
ultimately we can rectify it.
Could you start naming the correct this?
Two and a half minutes remaining. Two minutes remaining. Minute and a half remaining.
Okay, no further question needed, thank you. So are all my judges ready? And Brendan, 7 minutes?
Cool.
And the timer? All right, let's begin. Albert Einstein once stated, "Life is sacred." That is to say, it is the supreme value. Now, upon saying that, I negate the resolution and believe that developing countries ought not prioritize economic growth above environmental protection. Instead, both should be valued equally. Now, this means that I believe economic growth does not deserve superiority or prioritization due to the equal imperativeness of both economic growth and environmental protection to ensure the best quality of life in developing countries. So I agree with the definitions my opponent brought up, so for time's sake, I'm going to move on to my value. Now, my value is quality of life. Quality of life. Now, although this does encompass some of my opponent's value of basic needs, I believe there's one important distinction, and that important distinction is my first response is health. My first response is health. Now, essentially in cross-examination, my opponent was arguing that, well, basic needs basically lead to improved health, and that's basically the way to best improve overall quality of life. But economic growth, as I will prove throughout my case, is actually the worst detriment to individual health, and that is why it cannot be prioritized. So moving on to my criteria. Now, I have a criterion of sustainable energy, and a criterion is simply a way to achieve the value. An Oxford Dictionary, just to clarify, defines quality of life as the standard of health, comfort, or happiness experienced by an individual or group. Now, my next two contentions will demonstrate that prioritizing economic growth and environmental protection equally, or not prioritizing economic growth, best achieves the value of improved quality of life. So let's look at contention one. Prioritizing economic growth harms life. Prioritizing economic growth harms life. The Atlantic in 2012 discusses a man who lives in India and experiences the deadly effects of economic growth. He said his son wakes up vomiting in the middle of the night from the poisonous air and says, quote, India was burning, eroding, melting, and suffocating. Rivers, lakes, and glaciers were disappearing, and underground aquifers were being depleted. Report, almost half of India's land suffered from some kind of erosion, and 70% of its surface water was polluted. This was according to a study conducted by Yale and Columbia universities, concluded that India had the worst air quality in the world. Now, this was a direct result of India's desire to specifically prioritize economic growth. So let's look at subpoint B. Lack of environmental protection kills. Lack of environmental protection kills. The World Health Organization in 2016 said, quote, environmental factors are a root cause of significant burden of death, disease, and disability, particularly in developing countries. The impacts are estimated to cause 5% of death and disease globally, reaching nearly 35% in regions such as sub-Saharan Africa. Now, the impact is prioritizing economic growth and environmental protection equally would best save human life. As we see from About News said, quote, reducing environmental risk worldwide could save 13 million lives every year, according to the World Health Organization, factoring in environmental risk related to air pollution, water pollution, noise pollution, and UV radiation, all from economic growth. Sustainable energy improves quality of life. Sustainable energy improves quality of life. Now, sustainable energy, which does not prioritize economic growth, but values the economy and the environment equally, improves citizens' quality of life now without compromising the health of future generations. So let's look to subpoint A. The economy and the environment must be valued equally. The economy and the environment must be valued equally. DEFRA, or the Department for Environment, Food, and Rural Affairs, said, quote, economic and environmental performance must go hand in hand. The natural environment is central to economic activity and growth, and natural resources are therefore vital for securing economic growth and development, not just today, but for future generations. Sustained prosperity relies on environmental protection. Sustained prosperity or economic growth relies on environmental protection. Subpoint B. Sustainability is affordable and achievable. Sustainability is affordable and achievable. DEFRA, or the Department for Environment, Food, and Rural Affairs, said, quote, policies that improve the efficiency of which businesses use resources produce not just environmental benefits, but also financial savings. It was estimated that businesses in the UK could save up to $6.4 billion per year by taking low or no cost measures to improve their resource efficiency. Now, in addition to affordability, developing countries can also achieve sustainable energy. The United Nations Environmental Program said, quote, over the past 2 years, the green economy has gone from theory into practice. And one example of that practice is Application 1, Curitiba, Brazil. Application 1, Curitiba, Brazil. Now, the UNEP continues to discuss numerous success stories of sustainable energy working in developing countries' areas, specifically a 14-case study, but one is Curitiba, Brazil. It says, quote, through its innovative approaches in urban planning, Curitiba has been able to grow in population from 361,000 to 1.828 million without experiencing the typical drawbacks of congestion, pollution, and the reduction in public space. The economic and resource efficiency benefits are considerable. All in all, Curitiba presents a case study of how smart urban planning can avoid significant costs in the future, improve efficiency, productivity, and quality of life for all its inhabitants. Now, with my case stated, I'm going to go ahead and respond to some specific arguments my opponent brought up. Now, I already addressed his value, arguing that health is also an important consideration of that, and therefore quality of life should be considered superior value in today's debate round. So let's first look to his contention one. Basically, affirming the resolution meets the basic needs. Now, my first response is affirming the resolution leads to reduction of quality of life. Affirming the resolution harms life. Now, by taking the affirmative approach and prioritizing economic growth, we can see from empirical examples of India and the other applications from the World Health Organization, specifically stating that economic growth leads to environmental loss. Contention two, that basically negating the resolution doesn't meet the basic needs. My first response is sustainable energy needs. My first response is sustainable energy needs, meaning that if we simply over-prioritize environmental protection, we may not see the basic needs increase. But as a negative, I'm not arguing for that. I'm arguing for the equal prioritization of both economic growth and environmental protection. So his last contention is basically the Kuznets curve. I have a few responses to why this isn't a valid argument. My first is simply theory. Now, the DC Bureau in 2013 discusses that the EK-SAVE theory, which is the environmental Kuznets curve, is simply a theory and does not account for the importance of the environment enabling the growth. Basically, it continues to discuss that environmental protection is critical to sustainability in economic growth and therefore should be prioritized. Thank you, and I now stand open for cross-examination.
Okay. All of my judges are ready. Cool. Well, let's go ahead and start out with your first contention. So you mentioned that India experienced a lot of health problems because of its pollution problem, right?
Correct.
Okay, are you aware of how much of pollution is due to household air pollution when people don't have enough money to heat their homes, so they burn twigs and dung?
Yeah, I'm not aware of that specific statistic, but the evidence I brought up was from specifically economic growth.
Were you aware that that is the single biggest contributor to pollution?
I haven't seen evidence of that, so what I read was that the World Health Organization was saying that 25 to 30% of death was directly from economic growth.
Okay, you would agree that the resolution implies that we have to prioritize one or look to it first and not necessarily at the exclusion of the other, right?
Must prioritize economic growth, and I just simply need to give that, show you that it should deserve.
And you mentioned that India has like the worst environment in the world, right?
The poorest air quality.
Okay, great, excellent. Let's go ahead and move on and talk about your second contention. So you talked about how sustainable energy improves quality of life. Okay, underneath your point that it's affordable and achievable, you were talking about resource efficiency. Is that making the most of the resources that you're presented with?
Yeah, it's basically not prioritizing economic growth as over the environment, meaning that taking in environmental considerations, and it just a benefit of that was basically that we saw they also was more affordable than using just prioritizing economic growth.
Okay, interesting. And you also brought up an application of a city in Brazil.
Correct.
Okay, and you mentioned urban planning. What is urban planning?
That was just one. It was city management. I didn't read the entire quote from the evidence, but it was discussing specifically its sustainable energy policies of equally prioritizing economic growth and development.
You say it's sustainable energy policies, but what did the argument actually talk about in there? Was it talking about urban planning?
Talking about the economic and environmental resource efficiency benefits working together, and then some are considerable, and it led to reduction of pollution and reduction.
So again, resource efficiency, right?
Resource efficiency meaning that they were not using the environment and overusing the resources, which most cities who just prioritize economic growth would see.
Okay, interesting. Underneath my second contention, you brought up that sustainable energy means. So did you address the analysis that we can reduce poverty far better when we affirm the resolution than when we negate the resolution with sustainable energy policies?
Yeah, the specific argument of that, so that was my one response, and then the specific argument was in the application of principle of Brazil and the other UNDP countries.
Okay. You would agree that that's just one city and its framework can't necessarily be used to determine the rest of the world?
No, absolutely not. Curitiba, Brazil doesn't have a very strong economy or environment, but this one small city actually saw an increase of over 1.3 million people, and by prioritizing sustainable energy and not economic growth, we saw that they did see the pollution or reduction of public space typically associated.
One more question, sorry, that's probably all we have time for, but would you agree that we usually see cleaner environments in richer countries?
No, I would not agree with that.
Do you think that most rich countries have poorer environments than those countries that have poorer individuals?
I believe that if any country who chooses to prioritize environmental protection would see an increase in the environmental health.
Interesting. Can you start with them?
Yes.
Thank you.
Two and a half minutes remaining.
Great. Well, in this first affirmative rebuttal, I want to address each argument brought up by the negative, starting out with the value of quality of life, in which she analyzed health. I have two responses. My first response is that economic growth protects. Economic growth protects. My opponent talks a lot about reducing pollution, but my question for her is how are we going to do that without the monetary capacity to take care of it? The thing is that pollution is expensive to reduce and requires initial focus on economic growth. My second response, though, is that basic needs are foundational. Basic needs are foundational. The foundation to improving quality of life is getting citizens out of poverty and getting them access to food, water, and shelter. That should be our primary focus. Let's move on to the criterion of sustainable energy. My response is it's expensive. It's expensive because sustainable energy doesn't just entail resource efficiency and urban planning. That's not sustainable energy at all. Sustainable energy is things like solar panels and wind power, which, while great in theory, don't work in the developing world because they don't lift people out of poverty, as was essentially unresponded to in the last speech. Let's move on to the first contention. My opponent's main ideology under this stemmed based off of India. I have two responses. My first response is priority, not exclusivity. So as we agreed in cross-examination, the resolution does not imply that we have to value one to the exclusion of the other. And yet, in my opponent's last speech, she said that India literally has the worst air quality of any country on earth. If that's not an example of exclusivity, I don't know what is. But my second response is a turn, pollution is fixed with economic growth. A turn, pollution is fixed with economic growth. According to the Global Alliance on Health and Pollution, 44% of the deaths caused by pollution, that's the biggest single cause, is caused by household air pollution, which is the burning of twigs and dung when you cannot afford the energy to heat your homes. And in Africa, remember, that would have been caused if we had gone with sustainable energy policies. Let's move on to contention two. My opponent's first subpoint talked about how economic growth and environmental protection are valued equally. My response is that growth necessarily slows and people necessarily die. Growth slows and people necessarily die. With the negative mindset, we see economic growth slowing, which means that individuals cannot get out of poverty fast enough. Underneath affordable and achievable, my response is that resource efficiency is different from what we would think of as sustainable energy. Resource efficiency just means taking the same amount of resources, but being more efficient with what you do with them. That's completely different from the ideology proposed by the negative. Underneath the application of Brazil, my response is urban planning. We can't just look at urban planning and resource efficiency if we're going to look at really sustainable energy policies. Those are expensive. Solar panels are expensive, so is wind power. Underneath the next argument, my opponent addressed my first contention. She said that the affirmative reduces quality of life. My response is absolutely not. Here's the thing, is that the actual ideology that I promoted and the analysis that I had was unresponded to. My opponent agrees with me that economic growth will reduce poverty. And the thing is that poverty is the most important problem because poverty not only contributes to pollution, but it also makes people die from a lack of basic needs. It needs to be the fundamental thing that developing countries are addressing. Underneath the second contention, my opponent basically said that sustainable energy would ultimately meet. And my response is absolutely not. Again, the mindset that I promoted here, the actual analysis was unresponded to. I brought up analysis that was specifically discussing how in Africa, which by the way is a bigger analysis than just one city in Brazil, but in the entire continent of Africa, if a $20 billion investment was made into sustainable energy, it would lift far less Africans out of poverty than if it was made into the affirmation of the resolution. And we have to recognize that that impacts to a better quality of life with the affirmative. Underneath my third contention, my opponent responded to the environmental cousins curve by saying it's a theory. My response is that it's empirically proven and it makes sense. Okay, my opponent doesn't seem to agree with me on this, but I hope you guys can. When we look at richer countries, we always see cleaner environments. The environment is almost always dirtier when it comes to developing countries than it is in developed countries. And that can be seen in the US and Europe. So for that reason, please vote back. Thank you.
1 minute remaining. Thirty seconds remaining. Ten. Time.
So all the judges are ready? And the timer, and then the 6 minutes. All right. So first, I'm going to be responding to my opponent's argument of the value. Now, I found this a little interesting because essentially he was arguing that basic needs basically leads to improved health. My first response is irreversible damage. My first response is irreversible damage. Now, my opponent essentially completely disregarded my evidence from the World Health Organization stating that prioritizing economic growth leads to 13 million lives lost per year. Now, essentially, my opponent is arguing, well, through the environmental cousins curve and prioritizing economic growth, we can see that after economic growth is, after economy is stronger, we can then look to prioritizing environmental protection. If we look to prioritizing environmental protection after even 2 to 3 years, we see 26 million lives lost, 39 million lives lost. This is irreversible damage and alone a complete reason not to prioritize economic growth. The response is without sustainable energy, no clear poverty reduction. Without sustainable energy, no clear poverty reduction. Now, I kind of mentioned this in cross-examination, and I didn't really fully develop it as an argument, but I'm going to now. Basically, that economic growth does not actually help the poorest of a nation, meaning that an overall increase in the GDP does not help the individuals who are already at the bottom of an economy. It just simply adds to the riches of an already rich economy. Now, according to the World Bank, middle-income countries are home to 5 of the world's 7 billion people and 73% of the world's poorest people. Now, at the same time, middle-income countries represent about 1/3 of global GDP and are major engines of economic growth. So my opponent's entire argument is basically economic growth leads to poverty reduction. We can see that the middle-income countries, or the countries who have economic growth, actually have 73% of the world's poorest. Now, this is because prioritizing economic growth does not help the health of the individual. It does not help the health of the individual. Now, sustainable energy clearly does, and then we'll look to that in a few voting issues. Next, moving on to his responses of basically contention 1. He argued that sustainability is too expensive and it does reduction. Well, my first response is no poverty reduction through prioritizing economic growth. No poverty reduction through prioritizing economic growth. My second response is sustainability is more affordable. Sustainability is more affordable. Now here we see again My opponent did not respond to the evidence stating, specifically, he talked about the theory behind it, but he didn't respond that sustainable energy in the UK was actually $6.4 billion cheaper than if they would have prioritized economic growth. Now, I believe that is a clear example of how sustainability is very affordable. And if that's not sufficient enough, we'll look to my application one under, of Curitiba, Brazil. Now, again, this was a small, poor city in Brazil that took the unconventional approach of not prioritizing economic growth. And when they did that, we saw that they did not have a reduction of pollution, public space, or even general poverty. So basically, the sustainable energy approach in Curitiba, Brazil was the strongest of all Brazil, as opposed to significantly only prioritizing economic growth. Now, this next response is about India, and basically that not exclusivity. My first response is empirical example. Now, if you think that India wasn't valuing the environment at all, that's exactly my affirmative opponent's argument, that this is an example of when they prioritize economic growth, we see a loss of human life. My opponent has not demonstrated that we can somehow have environmental protection with economic growth. Now, we argue that through the environmental Kuznets curve, but that is not actually the case. When we look to my voting issues, I'll respond to that. Now, his next response is, we're essentially that people die from poverty, and then again with the basic needs and the resource efficiency. Now, my first response is basic needs are useless if you're not alive. Basic needs are useless if you're not alive. Now, again, my opponent never responded that 13 million people die per year, but he's saying, no, it's fine. We can look to the economic growth and the basic needs, and we can have a nice house, and then that leads to food. But if they are dying from pollution, that doesn't even matter, which is why we need to take the immediate step, reduce the loss of life, and value sustainable energy, and not prioritize economic growth. So let's look to a few voting issues. Voting issue number one is prioritizing economic growth kills. Prioritizing economic growth kills. Now, again, I kind of hate to keep harping on this number, but it's very significant. 13 million people die per year. 25 to 30% of deaths globally are from specifically prioritizing economic growth. Poverty reduction, as I've even demonstrated, isn't a clear benefit from economic growth, is not significant when you compare this loss of life to a potential poverty reduction. So let's look to voting issue number two. Sustainability is achievable. Sustainability is achievable. Now, my opponent mentioned some basically rhetorical and analysis responses of how sustainability probably won't even work. This is just one example. We can't really base our time and effort on this. But I'd just like to point out that the United Nations Environmental Program developed a specific 14-case study discussing that sustainability is not only the best way to improve the economy without sacrificing the environment, but it's possible. Now, those are 14 specific examples of different countries or cities who have prioritized sustainability and have found a significant advantage. My third and last voting issue is, sustained prosperity. Sustained prosperity. Now, my opponent never responded to this argument that even if we do prioritize economic growth, that will very quickly burn out, as we see that environmental protection is what sustains economic growth and long-term prosperity. So my opponent never responded to that, basically agreeing with the argument that sustained prosperity relies on valuing the negative side of sustainable energy. Thank you.
Two minutes remaining. Remaining. 1 minute remaining.
Let's start out this final affirmative speech by addressing the arguments brought up by the negative, starting out with the irreversible damage argument and the pollution deaths argument. So my response to this argument is the term pollution that, again, was kind of brought in the last speech. So here's the thing, is that I brought up analysis that 44% of the deaths that are caused by pollution are due to that method of gaining heat that individuals are subjected to only when they don't have the economic growth necessary to get out of poverty. And the thing is that that's a significant amount. That's the single biggest cause of pollution, and therefore the biggest cause of pollution-related deaths. So economic growth would fix. Underneath my opponent's second response, that without sustainable energy, there's not poverty reduction, and then the middle-income countries argument, I have two responses. My first response is that this is a new argument. So my opponent established this line of coordination, but never argued this in her constructive speech. So I would totally count this as a new argument, and I urge you to strike it from your flow. But I can go ahead and respond to it anyway. So my second response is that maybe middle-income countries just literally have more people living in them, and therefore maybe literally have the majority of the world's poor, because there's a lot more people that live in middle-income countries than low-income countries. We don't know. Okay, let's move on to the next argument that talked about how their sustainability is more affordable. And she mentioned Great Britain, which is really interesting because I brought up analysis in my first speech about Great Britain. In Great Britain, people are literally dying. Excess winter deaths have increased because people can't afford to heat their homes. Sustainable energy is a great concept. It's not affordable even for the developed world, let alone the developing nations. Let's move on to the next argument. My opponent talked about how India was an empiric example. My response is, again, priority. So here's the thing, is that in India, there is no way that you can say that that is priority and not exclusivity. If it literally has the worst air quality of any country in the world, if that's not an example of exclusive economic growth over environmental protection, then I don't know what is. Let's move on to the last argument that I flowed, which was about how basic needs are useless without life. My response is that the analysis under this point was dropped. So the thing is that, again, the analysis stands, economic growth will reduce poverty. But what's more, when you try to invest in sustainable energy policies, we brought up a quote in the first speech talking about how telling poverty-stricken nations to invest in wind energy and solar energy just drives their citizens further into poverty, and that's a very, very scary standard. Okay, the last argument was about the EKC, and my opponent said this was basically a theory again. So my response is just basically, does it make sense to you? Does it make sense that more developed nations have cleaner economies? It does to me, or cleaner environments. It totally does to me, because it looks like when you have more money, then you can protect the environment better than someone who's struggling just to meet the basic needs of their citizens. My one voting issue for you today is the resolution. We've proven that poverty is reduced with the affirmative position. We've even proven that pollution is reduced with the affirmative position, because the single biggest cause of pollution is due to individuals in poverty. So for that reason, more than anything else, please vote aye. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much.